Second of all, I'd like to point out that my personal preference for out-round timing is the timer of shame method, where you announce at the end of your speech how long it was. So if anyone has an objection to that, let me know. Okay, that's what we're going to do. Are both sides ready?
Yeah.
Then I call upon the Prime Minister to open this round. 7 minutes to go.
Okay, great. Thanks to everyone. There's a large crowd out here, especially for our first round. Thanks to the opposition, and we've hit them many times and enjoyed all of our rounds with them. So I can honestly say that you guys are one of the favorite teams to debate with. And thanks to my partner who has led us this whole way, even PM'd once, which is, you know, a miracle. In any case, we're going to propose a really kind of basic, you know, run-of-the-mill case. In 1979, the American-backed Shah of Iran was overthrown, the American embassy was overrun, involving the taking of a number of hostages. Expecting American military response, the Soviet Union invaded and occupied neighboring Afghanistan in order to secure itself in the region. In response to this action, President Jimmy Carter ordered the boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympic Games, which were to take place in Moscow. We're saying Carter should not have made this decision to boycott. Okay? Okay, cool. So like I said, the very first point, you're going to see this one coming, international efficacy. Carter is not known for doing effective things on the world stage, and this is one of them. Taking this action will clearly not alter the Soviets in their course of action. If it does no good, why take this action? Like, the Soviets aren't going to say, you know, shit, the Americans aren't sending their, you know, athletes to our games, let's get out of Afghanistan. That's not the way they think, that's not the way they work. Secondly, Afghanistan, simply put, is just not worth the effort. The Soviet Union has routinely engaged in human rights abuses. And what's more, the US was perfectly willing to attend the games before this incident. You know, say Hungary in 1956 was a much worse abuse of human rights than this. Or at least, it certainly looks hypocritical from our standpoint to have not done something before and to suddenly stand up now. No, thank you. Furthermore, this is an insult to the whole world, not just to the USSR. The Olympics are not a Russian event. They're not like the Moscow machine, you know, Olympics or something. They are the International Olympics. And for a major competitor nation like the US not to participate in the games delegitimizes them for everyone, which harms allies as well and nations on the fence. We're we're affecting more people than just Russia. It's kind of like getting into a fight and punching everyone in sight rather than your opponent. Secondly, this is harmful to US interests. Not only does it not do anything to the other side, it harms our own interests in the act. You know, there are basic economic harms associated. It's a big cash cow for all in terms of merchandising, sponsorship, and televising. The US loses out on all of this while still allowing the Soviets to partake and benefit from it. In fact, they get a larger share of the pie because suddenly our part of the pie is, you know, not being taken. Furthermore, like this, and this is really important, this harms the US athletes. The boycott literally destroys the dreams of athletes that have devoted their whole lives to competing in the Olympics. You know, you have little gymnasts who have been striving for their entire life to get on that balance beam and walk across in a straight line really well. And, you know, they only have one chance because after this they're going to grow and not be able to compete again. So, like, for those people, we shouldn't do this because it's kind of like, I don't know, sending the West Virginians to fight a war. You shouldn't pick on a discrete group of the Americans and sacrifice their interests for the sake of America as a whole. And, you know, it doesn't actually help them. But you disagree?
Okay. A lot of American soldiers have fought and died to try to win the Cold War. And you're worried that this one person won't be able to walk on a balance beam.
I mean, if destroying their dreams actually did something, then it might make sense. But in fact, you're getting no benefit from massive human cost in terms of like lives and dreams. And we think lives and dreams are important on this side of the house. This also kind of harms your US interests by distracting from the evil nature of the Soviet act and focusing the attention on this bad idea that the US had in response. I can't think of any, you know, similarities to what's happening in the world today as to, you know, bad US actions distracting from bad, even worse things that the other guys are doing. So I think that for these reasons it's clearly bad for US interests. But finally, we'd like to talk about the nature of the Olympics. Now, our team doesn't really get to talk about philosophy and morality that often, but we really think that this is an important point. The Olympics are meant to be a beacon of hope in times of conflict. People understand the special nature of the Olympics in the whole world. I mean, the Athenians and Spartans stopped fighting for the Olympics. You know, this has been historically a really important non-political tool, and Carter has turned it into some sort of ineffective pushy hammer that doesn't do anything, but is being still abused in the process. Like many other countries oppose the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I mean, most of Europe opposes it, except that which is under the Iron Curtain. But they're not boycotting the Olympics. They recognize that it's a bad thing. The U.S. is single-handedly undermining and abusing the Olympics as a political tool. Secondly, the Olympics are actually, by letting them happen, actually serve our interests. You know, Jesse Owens in the 1936 Berlin Games was incredibly important as a symbol undermining Hitler's Aryan mythology. We have a chance now because we have historically beaten the we have historically beaten the Soviet machine athletes with our kind of independently cultivated athletes. The Soviets have these farms where they essentially send little children and raise them under rigorous beating methods of sportsmanhood. And we, on the other hand, allow our sports athletes to flower independently and under their own sun. And I think that by allowing our athletes to demonstrate their superiority, you're actually serving U.S. interests. And C, any benefit associated with the boycott will be completely lost because the next year, or 4 years from now, are the LA Games. So if we gain anything at all from this, and I don't think we really will, Moscow would just repeat the action to us in a tit-for-tat that doesn't help anyone. So finally, I'd like to close on the kind of message that this sends to the world. What kind of fascist state doesn't allow its children to fulfill their dreams? We do not want to send that kind of message. We do not want to indicate those kinds of ideals are at work in America. And for these reasons, we want to let that little girl do her gymnast thing. 6:34 for that.
I thank the Prime Minister for his remarks and call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the deconstructive portion of the round within 8 minutes.
Okay, well, of course, thanks to everyone here, thanks to Michelle. Excellent speech from her to come. Of course, thanks to true friends on SideGov. And of course, thanks to everyone for watching this awesome show. Now, before I get into my actual points, I want to just kind of make one, overview about what this round is really about. On the one hand, we have international relations, an invasion of a country, lots of people dying, right? We have the Cold War. On the other hand, we have the Olympics. Now, the Olympics are cool and all, but which do you think is really more important, right? I think in the grand scheme of things, what you have to look at here is really what is best for international relations. I think the Olympics pale in comparison in their importance to the actual scheme of geopolitics. So that said, I want to talk about the message this sends, right? And it's easy to think that the message doesn't matter. But look, this is the Cold War, right? There's not open warfare constantly between the US and the Soviet Union. It really is a battle of ideals, right? It really is a question of who can convince other countries to support their side, who can get popular support within those other countries, right? Who can lead to governments that support their side being stable and have the support of their people instead of having, constant uprisings and rebellions. So what does this message send, right? The message that this sends is that we're not okay with you invading neutral countries, right? That this isn't the kind of acceptable action that makes you a just actor on the world stage, right? Recognize that there are some things that we think just do not, that if you do them, you no longer deserve to be a member of the international community, right? There's a reason that despite China having, huge numbers of athletes in the Olympics, we're just now getting around to finally giving them an Olympic Games, right? It's because we do take human rights violations into account. We do take the way a country behaves into account when deciding whether to give it this kind of platform, right? Whether to give it this kind of legitimacy on the international stage. Recognize that the Olympics do give international legitimacy to the country that they're held in, right? It's easy to talk about, one event in the 1936 Games, but the overall impact of those games was to legitimize Hitler, was to give him a stage on which to perform, right? He overall benefited from having the Olympics in Berlin during a time where he was trying to build up his military power. There is a legitimizing message here, and you definitely send a larger message about international norms by saying that we won't accept this, we won't treat you like a valid member of the international community if you're going to do these kinds of things. Next, though, it focuses attention on the conflict, right? Because recognize that Afghanistan might not be paid a lot of attention to other things. It's not the kind of country that is really important to the international economy. It's not the kind of thing that people really care about, right? It's the country, when you see a news story about it, you just kind of flip to the next page. Now, if you want to actually have an impact, if you want to show that you can't invade any country, right, that this is bad, you have to make it hurt. You have to make the rest of the world pay attention when the Soviet Union does something bad, right? It hurt the US when we got involved in Vietnam and lost, right? And it hurts the Soviet Union when they get involved in Afghanistan, but only if the rest of the world is paying attention.
Sure. You talk about making it hurt. How does it hurt the Soviet Union to give them more gold medals? Hurting the Soviet Union might be doing stuff like arming the Mujahideen.
Right, we'll do that too. But remember when I said gold medals really not that important, right? And that like who controls international public opinion is probably more important than who wins the most, little shiny things? Like, this is really not the kind of power measurement that we should be using in relation to the Soviet Union. Right? The conflict itself has lots of bad press associated with it, right? The Soviet Union is doing all sorts of bad things in Afghanistan, right? Lots of innocent people are dying. A country that wants to be free and is fighting for it is having its rights suppressed by a foreign aggressor. If you get attention paid to that, you just magnify the bad press that's already there. So you end up with more anger at the Soviet Union in the international community, at the time. But then, the last thing I want to talk about is what attention does, right? What the goal is when you try to get this attention. Now, there are lots of things that it can do. One is it can get other countries to aid the Mujahideen, right? Do things to hurt the Soviet Union. Other countries are going to be more willing to do that when A, their leaders recognize how bad the Soviet Union is, recognize how big a threat it is and how quickly they are to invade their neighbors, and B, when the peoples of those other countries are aware of this, when they see what's going on, when they see how big a threat it is, when they're willing to support a government that gives money to trying to stop this threat. So you end up with a world that's more willing and more able to do things to try to block this threat, to try to take care of the problem. And I think what this means is that the attention translates into the kinds of things that they're talking about to actually deal with the problem. That said, going back to kids, right? They say it won't change what the Soviets do, right? Well, not instantly, right? They're not going to just withdraw right away because you do this. But they are going to face long-term pressures, right? You are going to increase the general, the next time they look to invade some sort of random innocent country, they're going to look at what happened in Afghanistan, and look at what the reaction was. They do want international legitimacy, they do want allies, and they do pay a price for us. They say Afghanistan is not important, and Hungary was worse, right? Except here's the thing. There are Olympics going on in Moscow right now, right? You're not just boycotting the Olympics because they're random Olympics you don't feel like going to. What you're saying is the Soviet Union is such a bad power, right? So much a threat to the international community that it should not be considered a legitimate part of the international community, right? The same reason that certain countries now don't send teams to the Olympics. No thanks. Because the things they do to their athletes are really bad, right? Because it's not good when the country is organized in a fascist way, constantly challenging the international system, constantly leading to warfare. No thanks. Now, they say the Olympics are an international event, and it kind of hurts everyone when we don't have it, right? Like, to some extent this is true, right? Now we don't get to watch the person walk across the balance beam. That's really sad. But look, it hurts the Soviet Union a whole lot more, right? They're the ones looking to really gain from this. Now, they talk about U.S. interests, and their main U.S. interest seem to be money and the U.S. athletes, right? So, money. Does the U.S. actually gain money off of the Olympics? Not really, right? Like, there's a large Olympics industry which funnels money from Americans to other Americans, right? But no money actually comes into the United States when the Olympics are being held in Moscow, right? That's the country that gets whatever tourism comes along with it or whatever economic development comes along with it's going to be somewhat embarrassing for the Soviets to have big empty stadiums, right? Like this is going to have an impact on what the Soviet Union looks like. But then they talk about US athletes, right? Look, athletes have other competitions, right? There's not only the Olympics, they can still have successful careers as athletes. It's a little bad that they can't win medals here, but it's not that bad, right? This just pales in comparison to actual real political issues. Then they talk about the nature of the Olympics, right? I'm not sure Piaf even believes this one. He says they're a beacon of hope in time of conflict, right? We're in the middle of the Cold War and we'll see the Olympics and know that everything is fine. No, they don't do this, right? Like, it's nice, but when you have a system set up like the Soviets do, where you don't have actually separate actors and like real people just building up their, Olympic hopes from their own, you have a system here, right? You have this machine. You're not talking about this great idealistic thing where, people go out in their backyards and play sports, right? This is not what you're talking about. It doesn't have those kind of idealistic things associated with it. Now, they say they'll boycott LA. That might be true, but they won't have a good reason for doing it. They will look spiteful and angry. You look like you care about a foreign country being invaded for no reason. We're proud of it. 8:35.
I thank the leader of the opposition for his remarks and call upon the member of government to deliver an 8-minute speech reconstructing the government's case.
All right. Thank you guys very much. I've had a great time at Smith. It's great to see this sort of wave of Boston sitting in the room here. I'm very happy to be debating you guys in this hour round. Piat does an excellent speech earlier, much comedy. I'm sure much more comedy and analysis to come later. That said, I'm going to start with sort of their overview here. And they say, what is this round about? Like, the Olympics don't matter very much. It's really about sort of world security. Here's the thing. Obviously, we agree that the Cold War is more important than the Olympics. But when your actions regarding the Olympics are completely ineffectual, then you look at the margins. And at the margins, you're hurting people for essentially no reason. At the margins, you lose all of this stuff from the Olympics. When you have zero effect and minor bad things, that's significantly worse than zero effect and no minor bad things. And I think that's what this round really gives us. They say, ultimately, you're in the Cold War and you have to stand up and say this isn't acceptable. Recognize that there are many, many more legitimate ways of saying that this isn't acceptable besides boycotting a fundamentally international event that's not just a Soviet event. You could, for example, denounce them in the UN. You have denounced them previously. If it got really bad, you could withdraw your ambassador or do something like this. I don't think the world thinks that the US is happy that the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan. I think everybody's pretty clear that you're angry about this, that this is fundamentally a terrible idea from your point of view. And they say, ultimately, you'll send a legitimizing message to the Soviets if you go to their games. I don't think this is true at all. I think when you go to their games, you go to compete and you go to win. And this is something that's this is something that's actually important. The Olympics are and have always been an important propaganda tool, both in countries like the United States, but even more so in countries like the Soviet Union. They celebrate each Olympic victory, each medal, as a victory for the Soviet system, a victory of their way of life over ours. Hitler's system did the same thing. In Cuba, in Castro's Cuba, if somebody wins a medal in the Olympics, they become essentially a national hero for life. That's how totalitarian systems celebrate essentially the manlyhood or the vitality of their system. When you attack them on the track, you are actually, that's why the Miracle on Ice, things like that, that's why Jesse Owens is so important. When you attack them on the track, when you attack them on the field, you're actually attacking the viability of their system. You're saying freedom produces better human beings, fundamentally better individuals than your Soviet system. That's what you're saying. And we think that's actually important. We think that they can poo-poo this as much as they want, but when Carl Lewis goes to Moscow and kicks all their asses, you're going to know what freedom can do to you. And I think that's actually important. I think it is important to show the rest of the world not just that the Soviets are bad, because if you don't know the Soviets are bad by now, I think you're nuts. And you probably aren't going to figure out the Soviets are bad just because they've invaded Afghanistan, but also that the US can beat the Soviets, that provides just a fundamentally better alternative. All right, the next thing to talk about is how this focuses attention on Afghanistan. Recognize this is actually going to draw away attention from Afghanistan. But that gives you this point. And I think just by saying, no, they'll focus on it. Really, what everybody's going to focus on is, oh my God, Jimmy Carter's doing another stupid thing. He's taking another moral stance that's having no effect. That's what it's going to focus attention on. They're going to, focus attention on the lack of the U.S. at the games and all this without focusing on the suffering in Afghanistan. Every news story you might have had about the heroic Mujahideen or Pakistan's support for them or horrible Soviet atrocities will instead be like, oh, look at Carl Lewis at home, he's really bummed out. I think that it actually is a very serious detraction. I think it's crucially important. No, thank you. They say other countries will realize this is bad. Here's the thing. Everybody on Earth who's not part of the Soviet sphere has condemned this action. Those countries that matter, those countries that can actually do something about it, are literally you and Pakistan, and eventually Israel, but that's secret, and don't worry about that now. But it's you and Pakistan. Both of you already realize it's bad, and if you're going to do something about it, you're going to do something about it. You're boycotting the Olympics, has nothing to do with it. In Pakistan, they're sitting around saying, geez, this godless communist state has invaded the Muslim country next door. That's really bad. They're not going to sit around saying, guys, the US tells us that the Olympics are really bad because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Maybe we should do something about it. That's just not the thought process in play. The Afghans think it's bad, the Pakistanis think it's bad. That's what's crucially important. All those European countries who think it's bad, yeah, they think it's bad. They're still going to the Olympics, and you not going isn't going to change their minds about this. All right, so now coming case study. We talk about international efficacy. Recognize that every time you take a massive fundamental stand and it doesn't work, that hurts you internationally and that hurts you domestically. And that's pretty important. When you stand up and say, we won't stand for this, and then they do it anyway, that hurts you a lot. Like when Carter decided to lock himself in his room or lock himself in the White House until the hostages were freed, and then he had to stay there for days and days and days because he couldn't free the hostages, that looks really bad. It makes you look more ineffectual when you take a massive stance and the Soviets say, screw you, shoot.
So you've said time and time again that this doesn't work, but Adam provided you a whole list of ways in which it worked, and you just keep asserting that your side is right. Can you actually deal with the arguments that Adam made?
I don't think that Adam provided us with a really coherent list of ways, like a series of lists of ways why this would work. Recognize that you have to look at the way pressure works in the Soviet state, or the way the Soviet state makes its national security decisions. So, they say, we feel a security threat from the United States because they're now possibly going to be militarily involved in Iraq. So we're going to invade Afghanistan to assert our pressure in the region. They don't say, geez, the United States isn't coming to our Olympics, we should think about this. Maybe we shouldn't do this. Or the international community doesn't say, the United States has taken this stand, maybe we should now fall in behind them just because they boycotted the Olympics. None of these things are actually focused on the rational processes of how states make their national security decisions. They talk about how this is divorced from the Olympics, and we recognize that, except for propaganda, this is divorced from the Olympics. The Russians weren't thinking about the Olympics when they made this move. They think certain things are more important. That's why this is ineffectual. There's your analysis. No. All right. And here's the other thing. It's not like Russia wasn't bad before this. We talk about their previous human rights abuses. We talk about Hungary in '56. We talk about all of the things that the Soviet Union has ever done before this. And somehow, now that they've invaded Afghanistan, this is the fundamental shift that says you're not going to go to their Olympics. Remember, you gave them the Olympics before, when they were still the Soviet Union, when they were still supporting people in Vietnam, when they were still crushing dissidents at home, when they still had all of Eastern Europe under the Iron Curtain. That's who you gave the Olympics to. Recognize you played ball already, and now you're just making a ridiculous stand. We talk about how you are insulting the whole world, the international community, the international community specifically, because this is organized by the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, on which you have a vote, the Soviets have a vote, so does Panama, so does Cuba, so does Nicaragua. They decided, all of them together, that this is where this game should be. These games should be in Moscow, we'll have them there, then we'll have them in LA. It'll be like a fun symbol of reconciliation in the Cold War world. We think that's good, that's why they did Moscow, then LA. And we don't think we should tell the international community to go screw themselves just because we're getting snippy. We talk about the U.S. harms. We say, listen, there are economic harms. They say, no, you get no money from games in Moscow. One, yeah, you actually do. There's significant sponsorship for U.S. athletes. Recognize that the U.S. athletes who are the Olympic Games who are the ones who become the world symbols. The most famous athletes from this period is Carl Lewis. That's who people are going to be buying posters of in Germany and France and Spain. That's who people are going to be buying little track jerseys of, or booty shorts, or whatever you buy from track athletes. There are significant TV rights at play here. Recognize that NBC or whoever did this loses a lot of money. You are losing growth in the U.S. economy, and we don't think that's totally stupid. Here's the next thing. We talk about the harms to the athletes, and they say, well, whatever, they can just go to other events. Obviously, no other event is the same as the Olympics. I think all of us recognize the fundamental difference here. These guys are amateurs, they train all their lives to compete in the Olympics. We say our country is about the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. You are impeding their right to pursue happiness for a petty moral stand that's not going to have any effect. We say, when there's no effect on the margins, let Americans pursue their happiness, especially Americans who have striven to represent their country in the most honorable fashion on the fields of play. And we absolutely believe it. and Piot talks about, and this is actually legitimate, there is no reason that you should focus, that you should make these athletes bear the brunt of sort of U.S. foreign policy. They haven't opted into the system in any sort of way. He gives you the example of West Virginians going to war. It is fundamentally unjust, especially when it's ineffective. And especially when it's ineffective. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the nature of the Olympics. They sort of poo-poo this. They say it's not a symbol of world cooperation, whatever. Recognize the UN doesn't work. This is essentially the only international organization on Earth that actually works. We think there's something to that. We think there's something. We think there's something to be said for having one field where the entire world can come together in communion and say we're going to have these games regardless of stripe. That's what's happened every time before this, and we don't think Afghanistan has fundamentally changed the picture of the world in such a way that you should now sort of jettison your athletes or jettison the international symbol of the Olympic Games. Also, I've talked extensively about the propaganda benefits from this. Piot talks about this. This never ever went responded to. You do gain something when we win gold medals. You do gain something when we prevent Soviets from winning gold medals, when we prevent them from celebrating their successes. And remember, this is the Summer Olympics. There's no ice, no snow. We're going to crush them. That's absolutely sure. And the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the LA Olympics and the idea of tit for tat. They'll say, whatever, the Soviets will have no good reason for boycotting the games. No, the Soviets will have a reason. They'll say, the Americans were being incredibly petty, they boycotted our games, and then they boycotted the international community, so we're going to do the same thing. This just detracts from the international symbol of the Olympics. It detracts from the spirit of cooperation fostered by the idea of an LA and Moscow games. We think those are actually good things in this Cold War world. We think that ultimately we're going to have to come to some sort of understanding with the Soviets, some sort of like mode where we can live with them in peace. They've done a horrible thing here. We should deal with that horrible thing in ways that will actually be effective. We should fund Mujahid. We should possibly withdraw our ambassador. We should certainly condemn them in the UN. And we've done all these things. We've done it in the right way. There's no way to tack on this extra stupid thing that will just make you look weak and hurt American civilians. For all these reasons, proud to propose. I have no idea what my time is.
It was 9:30.
Okay, I thank the member of government for his remarks and call upon the member of opposition to close out the constructive portion of the round with a 8-minute speech.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, members of the panel. True friends on side government, really interesting case, and one I like a lot. Of course, Adam, great speaker, still to come. I want to begin with this sort of observation that Adam makes right at the top of the speech, right? He says, look, don't forget that international relations is just factually more important than the Olympics. We just shouldn't care about the Olympics so much that we start, loving our enemies because, we really think that, all the human rights abuses that they're taking, all the wars that they're fighting, all the innocent people that they're killing, and that really doesn't really matter because the people want some shiny things, right? Now, the response that we hear from side government is that it's ineffectual, which basically is the only point that I think he makes throughout the round in response to everything that we say. He says, but it's ineffectual, so nothing you say ever matters. He doesn't. He actually denies that Adam makes any arguments about why it's ineffectual, which is great, because I don't want to hear any new responses to it in PMR. So as far as this goes, just refer you to the entire case, where we make all these arguments about why it's so effective, in its own right. The first thing that Adam talks about, though, is this message that it sends, right? The response that we hear from Zach is that you could do other things. There are, other options you have. You could go to the UN. You could send money. You could do all kinds of things. I have two responses to this. The first one is you just don't get the kind of popular response that you can get with such an international event, with making this kind of statement. You're going to get your message to a whole lot more people in a whole lot more contexts than a speech that you make to the UN, which goes to all the UN ambassadors, which maybe a select group of people in every population will follow, which government officials will follow, but which the actual majority of the population of many of the countries of the world simply won't be paying attention to. We just get more effectiveness in terms of getting the message out to more people. But my second response is, these things aren't exclusive, right? There's nothing about boycotting the UN that makes, boycotting the Olympics that makes us unable to go to the UN and make a statement, unable to contribute funds or weapons or support the Mujahideen, any of these things. So really this point just is irrelevant to the round. Then they say, but it's an important propaganda tool for the United States to beat Russians. That's really great. Realize that it's an important propaganda tool for them too, right? They're providing this, this huge stadium, these great facilities, and here come the Americans to try and compete on their soil, right? Remember also that the host country at the Olympics always wins a whole lot more medals than they usually would. Russia will certainly win a ton of medals anyway. Realize this way, when the US, a major competitor in the Olympics, doesn't even show up, all those medals that that the Soviet Union wins will just look like a farce, right? It'll look like obviously the Soviet Union was going to win all those medals because the real competition didn't even come. It'll just look ridiculous, which is exactly the message we're talking about sending. Right? Like, I mean, what is it that they think you're actually going to prove, right? Oh my gosh, the United States has people who are really good at prancing around. Democracy must be better than communism, right? Like, this is silly, right? You're not proving anything with this. Now, the second thing that Adam talks about is focusing attention on the conflict, the sort of thing that I touched on in response to this, right? And, you know, they say, oh no, it's just Carter taking another one of his silly moral stances that has no effect, right? But, I mean, let's think about, I don't know, hypothetically, what might happen if the world thinks that your president is immoral? You know, is making all kinds of really poor moral decisions on the world scale. Like, I would rather have a president that takes the moral high ground, that tries to look idealistic and do the right thing on the on the world stage, you know, than one that doesn't care about innocent people being killed, the one that, you know, that is really okay with, you know, innocent countries being invaded and all kinds of things like that. They talk about like what's going to happen to poor Carl Lewis at home, and everyone's going to like be so sad. He's sitting alone. What do you think that like our athletes are going to say to the press? You think they're going to say, "Oh my God, I don't care about those, you know, those innocent civilians in Afghanistan who are getting slaughtered by the Soviet Union. I want my goddamn medal," right? No, they're going to be like, "I support what the U.S. is doing, and I understand the decision that has been made. I don't understand why we're going to feel like so bad for these poor athletes, right? This is just ridiculous." The final thing that Adam talks about is what attention does. Realize that you get other countries to aid, you know, the Mujahideen. You get this sort of press. You get the people of these countries to actually take notice where they might not have noticed through these other means, right? You get those people to put pressure on their governments and support government action, you know, where that government might not have intervened before. These are all the reasons that Zach says Adam doesn't even give you, and he like outwardly says he's not going to deal with because he doesn't think they exist, right? He says another interesting thing. He says everyone has already condemned this action. Everyone, you know, apparently that's just Pakistan, right? Newsflash, there are other countries in the world. When he talks about Pakistan, and when he talks about, you know, Israel, which he didn't really say, those are the people in history who got involved. You know, and I think this is ultimately breaking principles. But look, anyone could send money. There are tons of countries in Europe that could send money. There's like certainly capable of this, and there's no reason, I'll take you in a moment, there's no reason to think that they couldn't do it, especially once people in these countries know what's going on. You know, I think certainly we could get a lot more people involved if we brought that message out on a larger scale. So, going back to this. The first thing they talk about, oh my gosh, I totally wasn't expecting this because this is like their only point, international efficacy. Okay, sure, I'll take it.
Sure. All these other countries that, you know, could send money, could do all these things, you think their governments actually aren't aware that the Russians just invaded Afghanistan, just like took over a country? Like the government in Britain is just like, holy shit, you're boycotting the Olympics? Why? The invasion of Afghanistan, hot damn! Like, some countries are just more effective at helping in this situation.
Right, Pakistan, right? The only country with effective ways of working in the world scale. No. But look, here's the way that it's going to happen, right? The French government might not think that it's like that big of a priority for, you know, for the French country to actually commit themselves to, you know, to do anything in this situation. But what happens when like many more French people are aware of the situation? They're going to care more. That's going to be reflected in sort of like the ways in which they communicate with their government. You know, the sort of people that they elect, the sort of protests that they have. Oh boy, French protests. There's going to be plenty of pressure on the government of France to do something. This sort of thing can happen in countries across Europe, countries throughout the world, right? Like, I think this is very straightforward, how you might have something that's not a government priority become a government priority when the population of that country finds out about that controversy, right? I think this is really straightforward. And again, Zach just says, we give you no reason. Now, another interesting thing that Zach tells you is that except for propaganda, there's no effectiveness, right? But that's what we say. It's the Cold War. We're not fighting an actual war. It's a propaganda battle for basically like the hearts and minds of these people. You want to convince people that, you know, that the ideology of the Soviet Union is not the ideology to follow. Propaganda is exactly where it's at. But I think propaganda is a point for them because of these Soviet gold medals. You can cross-apply what I said before. Like, the Soviets winning tons of gold medals when the US doesn't show up is just going to make them look like idiots. I think clearly the propaganda win is on the side of the US here, for all the reasons that we've given you time and time again. They tell you also that the Soviet Union has done lots of bad things before, and we didn't care at all about that. The first thing I'd say is, like, maybe that was wrong. like, maybe not caring when someone does lots of bad things is a bad idea. Like, it doesn't mean that we should keep doing that stupid thing over and over again because we did it in the past, right? You know, like, they're definitely still bad if they continue to do bad things. Thanks, guys, that's just even more reason why we should boycott their Olympics, why we shouldn't respect them having that sort of platform on the international scale. They talk a little bit about the IOC. like almost all the money that the IOC gets comes from like the US, comes from all that merchandising, all that money that the US raises related to the Olympics. If you don't attend this Olympics, if you take that source of funds away from them, that's a real deterrent effect sent to the international community that we don't want to promote, the USSR. We don't want to promote countries like the USSR in this kind of way. I think that's a really compelling argument for our side. Now, right, they say, oh, the athletes are so sad, blah, blah, blah. I think this is really all, I think this is way far out of the round already. Like, oh, well, you don't have any fundamental right to go to the Olympics, right? Like, where's that in our Constitution? They say this is the only international organization that works. But I think ultimately, it's not working if we use the Olympics to ignore geopolitical realities, to stop caring about our values as a nation. It would be really nice if we could have this great spirit of cooperation, but I don't think it should happen by indifference. I don't think we should let terrible atrocities happen in the world and do nothing, just so that it seems like we can pretend like everything's okay. We're very glad to do it. That was 8:32.
I thank the member of the opposition for her remarks and recalls the leader of the opposition to deliver his first rebuttal speech of the round lasting for 4 minutes.
Okay. Well, of course, thanks to everyone here. I think it's actually been an excellent round. Now, there are really just kind of two things you have to consider here, right? The first is, what are the harms of boycotting the Olympics, right? They give us a couple. They admit they're really small, but they give us a couple. Then you have to consider, what do we gain by boycotting the Olympics, right? They claim it's literally nothing. And I think that's actually what they need to show to win this round, because their harms are so small that they basically have to show we have literally no gain whatsoever by boycotting the Olympics. So first, what are the harms they show us, right? They basically say no. But they say, right, the little girl doesn't get to walk in a straight line really well, right? This is really bad. No shiny thing for this person. Look, like, it's bad, yes. It's not that important. Now, remember that there's also things we gain, right? Like, when the Soviet Union hosts the Olympics, that's a real propaganda boost for them. More so when they host than when they just attend an Olympics, right? There's something special that comes to the host country putting on this event. So, we take away that propaganda chance for them. Now, we might lose a propaganda chance for the US that comes from us winning medals, except it's not clear we're going to win any more than the Soviets, right? The host country always does well, and the Soviets are really good at this. Remember the machine of raising athletes that Pia talked about, right? We prevent future Olympics from being held in places like this, right, through this effect on the IOC, because they rely on American advertising money as their main source of income. So by taking that away, you disincentivize holding the Olympics in places where the US might boycott. But look, let's say you're really worried about the athletes, right? Like, let's give a generous interpretation. This is the big downside. We don't get to go to the Olympics. The nature of the Olympics are under. Okay, fine. What do we potentially gain? And here's where I think they lose their end, right? Because by admitting that what they're giving us as harms are so small, they're putting such a high burden on themselves to beat everything we give as a possible gain that they could just really never win this one. We say, look, this gives real public attention. The kind of public attention that your ambassador saying something really angrily isn't going to get you, right? The everyday person in the rest of the world is going to be aware of what's going on in Afghanistan because they wish they were watching the Olympics, and now instead of the Olympics you have Soviets fighting Soviets for really meaningless shiny things that have no meaning when compared to the actual competitiveness of international sport, right? So instead of an actual fun Olympics everyone likes to watch, you have this meaningless charade that makes the Soviets look dumb. The average people in the rest of the world are going to be aware of this, right? Are going to see what's happening. Now, this has two effects, right? The first is the general effect on the Cold War. The US is saying, we don't really like when you invade foreign countries that you have no right to invade. We don't like when you kill thousands of people. We're not going to treat you like a normal, respectable country that can deal in normal, respectable ways with the rest of the world. We're going to say you have no right to do this. Now, we're also going to show that we're doing things about it, right? The other things that they want us to do. This makes the US look like the good guy, right? The one trying to make the international order into the kind of place where people in the world actually want to live. The kind of person that you'd like to be victorious in the Cold War. Right? Now, public support matters. But then it also matters with regard to this particular event, right? With regard to the invasion of Afghanistan. Because what do we tell you? We say, look, the people in the French government might have heard your ambassador. The people in the British government might have heard your ambassador. But the average person on the street didn't, right? They really paid no attention to something happening in Afghanistan, which they probably couldn't locate on a map, right? But when you talk about the actual harms going on, about the innocent people dying, right? There's like a bit of a peace movement at this time that can actually get on the streets and protest, right? It doesn't take all that much to get people protesting. And when that happens, you end up with governments, right? And remember, our allies are democracies who are more likely to actually do something about it, more likely to support. Now, he says that only the US, Pakistan, and Israel can do anything about this. But that's just not true, right? Any mechanism the US has is also available to Britain. Not quite on the same scale, but definitely on a large enough scale to matter. So you have these countries much more likely to do something about the invasion. That's much more likely to get the Soviets defeated in Afghanistan, which is a huge political objective, and has a huge impact on the history of the world. We're proud to oppose. My time has stopped for a second. I have 14.
Okay, thank you, Leader of the Opposition, for his remarks, and call upon the Prime Minister to close out the round with a 5-minute address.
Okay, great. When I was last up here, I gave a kind of fluffy speech, but I'm afraid that it's lulled the opposition into thinking that we really have a fluffy case, when in reality, we're just as willing to grapple with the IR points that they're making. What they fail to recognize is that an ineffective boycott is much more harmful to U.S. interests than no action at all, and that's where they lose this round. They don't recognize the harms of taking petty actions on the world stage that do no good to the U.S. But let me deal with their kind of new point about sending a message to the IOC not to host games in Moscow. I think that, first of all, we're not sending a message when we're still paying our dues and participating in the IOC meetings and all that. So this is like the message they're sending through the Olympics, i.e. completely ineffective. Furthermore, we don't want to send the kind of message to the IOC that we're willing to pervert you and use you as a political tool. We don't want to get the IOC to be making the kind of political judgments that are about good guys, bad guys. That's a fundamental. The message they want to send to the IOC is that we want to use the Olympics as a political tool and abuse it. And I think that that's contrary to the nature of the IOC and its historical role in the world. So we don't want to send the kind of message that they're looking to send to the IOC. And we're not sending much of a message if we're still paying our dues. Now let's go to the point that we talk about a lot about, the first one, which is like, are sports important? They might not think that sports are important. I don't really like sports that much, but many people in the world do care about sports, and they acknowledge this themselves when they talk about how people watch the games, etc., etc. We think that insofar as sports, your athletes are representing your nation, that these games are tremendously important. The U.S., they say, no, the U.S. won't win because it's in Moscow. Like, historically, the U.S. has always won the summer games dramatically in terms of gold medals. We just have people that can run the track really well. They have skiers and what was it? Ice skaters. Like, that's the way the games go. We think that we have a high likelihood of winning these games, and that seeing the U.S. win on the fields of glory, our kind of flower, independent, blooming athletes versus their machine athletes, is a really good message to the rest of the world that you can succeed through non-coercive methods. You can succeed by letting your athletes develop on their own. And for these reasons, we think it's tremendously important for the PR boost of having our athletes win. But next, let's talk about the kind of message to the rest of the world. Like, what kind of country are we saying we are when we don't allow our athletes to compete in the games? We're asking one part of our country, and they never effectively deal with this, to sacrifice their essentially lives up until this point, until they're 18 years old, they've devoted their lives to this, for the sake of a symbolic message that does no good. I think that we don't, no other country has organized such a boycott, although lots of other countries oppose the invasion of Afghanistan. The U.S. is supposed to be the land of the free. We're not free enough to send our own athletes to let them participate and pursue their own happiness. I think that's tremendously important, and it's very fascistic to not let your country, your kind of athletes participate in the games of international hope and joy. And then, furthermore, we're also saying essentially screw you to the rest of the world. These are not the Moscow Games. It's not some sort of head-to-head match between the U.S. and Moscow. Everyone in the world is harmed by U.S. athletes not going, like suffers from the U.S. athletes not going. The games aren't going to be as much fun for the Frenchmen watching TV, and they're not going to be happy about that. We think that this is kind of punching everyone scenario that you don't want to be doing as the U.S. You want to get allies on your side. But finally, let's deal with what serves the U.S. interest best. And this is really where the entire debate comes down to. And I think everyone has agreed on both sides that this is the most important issue. They give us really two kind of reasons in which they think that boycotts will help. The first one is a statement to delegitimize the invasion. First of all, the invasion is already completely delegitimized. When every country in the world opposes it, except for the Soviet bloc, we think that you're not doing anything more to delegitimize the games. Zach talks about Pakistan, not because Pakistan is the only country that opposes the invasion, but because it's one of the most important countries that oppose the invasion. They can do a lot in Afghanistan because the border's right there. They can't just poo-poo this away. Secondly, we don't think that taking the kind of useless action of symbolic action when you're still engaged with them on the UN. They never proposed wholesale withdrawal from UN or from Soviet interaction. What they're defending is an isolated withdrawal from one form of interaction with the Soviet Union that doesn't involve anything important besides kind of symbolism. I think that kind of action does not do anything to delegitimize them, and that most importantly, they've already been delegitimized because nobody views the action as legitimate. And then their second idea is that they're going to draw attention. People already know what's happened. It's not like the National Geographic cover was an Afghani refugee in 1979. We think that it's very clear that the rest of the world knows that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The French are going to suddenly riot in the streets because the U.S. athletes aren't in the games. All this does is distract from the horrors of the Soviet Union, the Union's invasion. We can let those abuses of refugees stand for themselves, but instead of distracting them with stories about poor U.S. athletes at home. And then lastly, I'd like to focus on how when nothing happens, it actually looks bad for the U.S. Like they utterly miss this entire part of our case. Soviets are immune to international pressure, like for example Hungary, and are not going to sacrifice what they view as their national security for the sake of U.S. athletes. So therefore, if this action has no effect on the world stage, everyone's already aware of the games, this isn't a very big message to delegitimize them, then all the U.S. is doing is harming its own athletes, harming its own country, taking this kind of petty action, while at the same time not doing anything effective. I think that's incredibly important, and it makes us look bad and ineffectual on the world stage. So I'd like to close with kind of a look at what the world looks like after the U.S. boycotts it. The Soviets are still in Afghanistan. Okay, that's bad. If the U.S. boycotts, the Soviets triumph at the games. That's bad. The U.S. athletes, all sorts of horror stories about U.S. athletes, crying at home because their dream of balance beam walking has been, denied for their entire lives. And the U.S. looks petty and ineffective. That they haven't offered us any concrete benefits from this, besides the ones they've already effectively dismissed. So I don't think the U.S. should ever do kind of ineffective action on the world stage that only harms its own interests and has no positive benefit. For these reasons, I'm proud to propose.
How long was that?